I just wanted to quickly start by, I'm one of these people, I have to really simplify things in order to know what we're talking about. So I just want to say some really simple things first about the relationship between economics, psychology, and anthropology. I mean, I hope not too obvious, but obviously economics, so as we said at the start of the day, since the 2008 crisis, economics has been heavily criticized, well, before 2008, but anyway, for having lost touch with reality, for using post-real models in their work. That's the words of the chief economist of the World Bank, actually said that. So there's been all this criticism, but obviously economists are extremely interested in reality and in truth, so that a huge amount of empirical economics is done, and indeed today, if you talk to young economists, they're doing big data kind of science work, and they're doing randomized control trials and so on. So clearly, economists are super interested in reality, and yet we can say that ultimately economics is a rationalist discipline, right? That is, it's not about collecting more and more information about the world per se, but rather using our brains to try to theorize what's going on. So Robert Lucas, who's been already invoked a few times today, Nobel Prize winner, of course, for his work in rational expectations theory in particular, he said, economists, when we invent these models based on crazy assumptions, this isn't our way of avoiding reality. This is the way we found to think seriously about reality, right? So this is classic rationalism, right? Descended from Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right? The crucial thing is here. By contrast, psychology is obviously much more empiricist in orientation as a discipline, i.e. it's geared towards studying real psychology, for example, through experiments on actual human beings, right? So it's a very different kind of underlying approach. So Daniel Kahneman, the kind of famous ancestor of modern behavioral econ, we could say, tells us, he was really shocked when he first read about the psychological assumptions of standard economics, that people are rational, that they're selfish, that their preferences don't change, etc. And he says, well, I've been professionally trained as a psychologist not to believe a word of this, right? So he's completely shocked that these could be the psychological assumptions of this other discipline. So he and others now, actually thousands of others, have been working to show economists that how real people, think, reason, decide, etc., is heavily shaped by a range of cognitive biases or dispositions that we as humans share. So a famous example is loss aversion. The empirical evidence shows that we intuitively care a lot about giving up things that we actually have. One could say to an irrational extent. That is, we don't maximize utility when it comes to the stuff that we already have. So that's a kind of empirical example from the psychologist. But note that this is a particular kind of empiricism that we find in psychology, which is based to a large extent on creating kind of artificial experimental bubbles in which variables that might matter in the real world are sort of bracketed off from consideration, right? So whereas economists have models that are unavoidably detached from reality, psychologists have experiments that are unavoidably detached from reality. It's just what you have to do, right? If you don't do that, you can't do the experiments. So in psychology, we always have the problem of ecological validity, right? Would this actually work in the real world? And often the answer is, well, we don't really know because it's so hard to properly test. And of course, there are lots of ways of trying to sort of get around that. So anthropology, which is my discipline, is empirical too, but in a much, much stronger sense, right? So one can actually say that anthropology is a radically empiricist discipline, right? So we study ordinary people in the real world, caught up in the flow of actual life, observed in as naturalistic a way as possible, right? We want to know what it's really like out there, so we observe and we listen a lot, and we even participate trying to get the actual feel of things, right? So if I do research, as I've done in northeast China, in farming villages, there's very heavy drinking culture, so of course I drink baijiu, the rice wine, I get drunk, I throw up on the family dog, etc. Right? That's just part of what I'm supposed to do and part of what the LSE actually pays me to do. So as part of this rather sort of crazy method, we don't exclude any variable from consideration, right? So literally anything. The way people sit, stand, arrangement of furniture in the room, how people treat the family dog, etc. Anything could turn out to be relevant to the topic that we're trying to study. Now, obviously, this brand of super strong empiricism has both advantages and disadvantages. So one disadvantage, a big negative, is that it can lead to us describing more or less everything while explaining nothing, right? Obviously, you could just endlessly tell stories about the world. A positive is that anthropologists are able to bring a dose of detailed folk realism from around the world into social science, which is great, and in this way help us to avoid a kind of crude Western universalism in our work. Having said that, the most basic lesson from all that anthropology is a universalist one in the end, which is that humans are essentially a social species, of course, and this is the point of Webb's first talk this morning, and really anything that an anthropologist will say is that we're a fundamentally social species, and this means, among other things, that treating economic psychology as a mind-internal phenomenon of individual thinkers can be quite misleading, right? That would be a typical anthropology point. So I want to give a quick illustration of this from my first fieldwork, which was done not in China but in Taiwan, in a fishing village back in the 1980s. So the people there fish in these small boats in a kind of region right around Taiwan. But this isn't generally so profitable, right? You don't make so much money there because basically all the fish have been fished out, more or less. This is in the 80s, right? So not recently. What they can do instead is make a longer trip to the Philippines, where there's a lot more fish, but it's illegal. You can be arrested. There are pirates in that kind of sea, the Luzon Strait, kind of between Taiwan and Philippines. And there are typhoons, right? Everybody knows typhoons hit Taiwan, right? So it's a way to make money, but it's dangerous. So how do they decide what to do? So at the aggregate sort of behavioral outcome level that I think would interest most economists, I don't think this is that mysterious in a way how these decisions are made. And we're dealing here with a very market-savvy population in Taiwan, right? I'm not trying to exoticize these people in Taiwan. They totally get, right, how markets work. So, if the price of fish were to go through the roof, I'm confident that people there would be more prepared to take these dangerous trips, right? I don't doubt that that would be the thing that would happen. If by contrast the price of fish stays the same, the level of risk goes through the roof for whatever reason, I think they would stop making these trips. But of course, real life, as we all know, is more complicated than that. So there are more considerations that come into it. So actually, since my fieldwork in Taiwan, most Taiwanese people have mostly stopped doing this kind of small-scale fishing altogether, right? They just don't do it. Not just because of the quantifiable risk of typhoons and so on, but more importantly because of broader and actually very hard to predict shifts in the regional political economy, right? So they don't do it not because of the immediate danger for one trip, but actually because there's a way of making a living in this shifting political economy. It just doesn't really make sense anymore. So in fact, I think some of the classic debates in economics about risk and uncertainty are highly relevant to this kind of... Actually, I should say that I'm I'm one of the anthropologists who likes economists. So, it's worth mentioning. I haven't really come here to preach to economists, but anyway, so I just say that. I'll also add that I like psychologists too, and many of the cognitive phenomena around risk and uncertainty that people like Kahneman and other psychologists have explored in their work, I think also are relevant to this kind of case in Taiwan. So, for instance, one extremely interesting finding is that people, if I've got it right, tend to overestimate the chance of unlikely events, such as a death by typhoon, happening, and then overweight the potential for those unlikely events in their decisions, right? So that's a classic kind of, behavioral finding. But of course, most anthropologists, being radical empiricists, would just frame this story in a completely different sort of way. So first they would point out that, and of course so too would many psychologists now, that consequential decisions of this kind aren't normally made by individuals anyway, right? Again, we're a social species, so these fishermen are in crews, first of all. There are a bunch of guys on each boat. And moreover, they're all in families and they're all in the community and so on. So these decisions involve not just the crew, but also the wives, their parents, their siblings, their children, as I've seen, tell them what to do, their neighbors and so on. So the decision networks that expand out from one boat can obviously be very big. Second, anthropologists would stress that real-world decision-making of this kind is always going to be heavily shaped by a lot of cultural historical artifacts that are going to be there in the cognitive environment where this expanding sort of decision network is operating. So what's a cultural historical artifact? Things like ideas, beliefs, practices, objects, material objects like this, the computer, mechanisms, institutions, etc. So these are things that are not just naturally occurring phenomena, but rather realizations of human thought and action. So the point is that these artifacts heavily mediate, support, and bracket distributed human cognition, and often actually determine decision outcomes. So a coin toss is a simple example of that. Why think about it when I can just toss a coin? So in my fieldwork village, which is in the real world, a highly pertinent example of this sort of coin toss type thing relates to religion. We haven't talked about God yet, so now we will. So in this highly religious village, there are many spirit mediums, and when it comes to important decisions, for example, about going to the Philippines and possibly getting killed, right, in order to make money for your kids to go to university or whatever, when it comes to important decisions, these people will consult with the gods through the mediums. How this actually works in practice is really complicated. And of course, the ethnographic detail of it can be mind-boggling, right? If you decide to pursue it to the end, you can write your whole doctoral dissertation simply on, how that spirit medium thing works in relation to fishing trips and so on. As part of the complexity in this kind of case, the question of how religious beliefs per se actually factor in everyday economic reasoning is itself highly complicated. So cognitive anthropologists, who've written a lot about this, say, religious beliefs are a very special kind of human knowledge, semi-propositional in nature, very subject to contextual priming, held on the basis of deference rather than direct experience, etc. So it's a very particular kind of knowledge. How that sort of knowledge interacts with the other sorts of knowledge that we all as humans have, in this case, knowledge about typhoon forecasts, right? Or knowledge about fishing prices. That's also a complicated kind of question. And then to top it off, we're not talking about one person's beliefs and knowledge, but rather that across a whole distributed network of persons, right? So it's a stunningly complex thing. So that takes me back to our three disciplines, economics, psychology, and anthropology. So I wouldn't really expect economists or psychologists to be that excited to know that in rural Taiwan, spirit mediums play some role in some cases of economic decision making. I mean, after all, economists ignore many features of reality, right? So, you know, they can ignore this feature of reality as well. Actually, there's a nice quote from Goll and Pessendorfer, who dryly observe, actually they're talking about the psychological critique when they say this, populating economic models with flesh and blood human beings was never the ambition of economists, right? So there you go. So I don't expect there to be big excitement, but when asked to explain themselves, why I went, why I didn't go, people in the Taiwan village I studied often just say, the God told me what to do, right? So as anthropologists, we feel that statement has to be taken incredibly seriously, right? We would never say, how foolish of you, right? Of course. We'd say, isn't that fascinating? You know, tell me more, right? Moreover, their economic psychology clearly is inflected by religion in a very, 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 very significant way. It's just pervasive, right? It's there anytime, anything about household decisions, investments in human capital, education, buying and selling property, anything comes along, religion is part of the discussion. So to put this differently, if it is true, as many, many economists have now accepted, that a cognitive tendency such as loss aversion can actually really matter for economic outcomes in Taiwan or anywhere else, so must it also be true, and it's arguably even more true, I would say, that cultural artifacts related to religion can really, really matter, right, in this particular place. Moreover, and this is actually the main point that I wanted to make today, religion isn't just an exotic cultural thing that's only relevant, you know, to this handful of people who live in these traditional type places like Taiwanese fishing communities where there are a bunch of spirit mediums. So in the last few years, I kind of gave up on China and Taiwan. I've been doing research in Oklahoma, in the U.S. heartland, you know, kind of Trump voting heartland of America. And people there also often take economic decisions with reference not to markets, you know, and we're talking about their stories, of course, that they tell, not with reference to markets or their own internal kind of thought processes, but rather with reference to God. You know, why did they do what they did? It's what God told them to do. Actually, I saw a recent Pew report which suggests that around 84% of people around the world claim a religious affiliation of some kind, right? 84%, right? And what I would like to argue, that's just religious affiliation. You could interpret, you know, what this means a lot. I would just say, as an anthropologist, I would, you know, ramp this number up to 99 point something % of humans have religion. If by religion what we essentially ultimately mean is having a transcendent moral sensibility that's at the basis of the social, right? I'd basically say it's a universal to be religious, right? And yet, how much does religion ever feature in our discussions of economic psychology? So if you read, you know, Daniel Kahneman's wonderful Fast and Slow book, which is terrific, you know, you'll find nothing about this topic in there. I think there are two very passing references to religion, but that's it. Okay, I'll quickly give just one more really quick example and then I'll wrap up because it's the sort of other one I wanted to mention, which is that in these sorts of communities that I've studied, economic decisions are heavily shaped not only by artifacts of religion, but also artifacts of kinship, right? So, you know, the trad kind of Chinese view, of course, was if you're in relation to risk, is that if your son is married and he's giving you a grandson to ensure patrilineal continuity into the future, you have less need to take risks, right? Because you're kind of sorted out. So now why take a bunch of risks late in life? Of course, that artifact changes in history, right? Now there's actually a bit of a daughter preference, you know? And obviously it varies culturally, right? So the people in Oklahoma don't have the same ideas about kinship that the people in China have. Of course, it's a different culture. But I would just stress that this sort of, some version of this Chinese kinship thing that heavily influences, economic decision making in the real world is true in Oklahoma as well. That is in the heartland of the supposedly individualistic and modern West. So just notice that in China, which we think of as a familistic Confucian society where they're obsessed with all the ancestor temples and all of that, everybody still talks about it a lot. It's really important, but actually many, many, many people live hundreds and thousands of miles away from their families because of migration. In America now, the opposite pattern is happening. There was a wonderful New York Times article summarizing some of the recent sociological research, which had the headline, "The average American now lives 18 miles away from mom," right? And the point being that, in this, what Chinese would think of as the kind of anti-family American individualists, actually people are living close to their families. Why? Because they need it, right, in order to survive, partly in this situation where the economy is at least perceived to be on a steady decline. Okay, so just very super quickly wrapping up about the relation between the three disciplines. Basically, I think that anthropologists can continue to ignore economics. And the reason that I say that, I think it's great to have a dialogue. I actually love to read economics. I thought that Lucas's book on economic growth to me was really stunningly eye-opening. I think it's fantastic. But I think the level of aggregation and so on that economists engage in just makes it really hard to really, for anthropologists to use it. I think we need to talk a lot more to the psychologists, right? There's been a sort of bias in anthropology against psychology because we don't like, the idea of individual kind of mind internal psychology, but actually psychology has moved on massively since we had that idea, and I think that should change. As for economists, I think it would be very good for economists to read some of the ethnography that anthropologists write around the world about economic life, just to be reminded not of exotic facts about the world, but actually obvious facts about the world, such as the importance of religion, right, which can easily fall completely off the radar, even though it's really incredibly important in the real world. And of course, I'm very aware that there are economists who work on religion, right? And there are economists who work on kinship. Gary Becker being a super famous example who did tons of theorizing about that, right? That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that all human agents, right, in all human societies, are heavily shaped by artifacts of kinship and religion. That means that the agent that's at the heart of our models needs to take that into account in some way, or at least it should be considered as a factor that influences all agents everywhere, just as cognitive biases and dispositions might affect all agents everywhere. So I'll stop it there.